We are very honoured to have Nick Cave with us tonight on his very first visit to Australia. I'd also like to warmly welcome Nick's studio manager, Bob Faust. It's been a great pleasure to have them here, and they've been very generous with their time. Nick Cave is one of the most important artists of his generation. He's best known for his formidable soundsuits, a true confluence of fashion, performance, and sculpture. Nick lives and works in Chicago, where he is professor and chairman of the fashion department at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Over the last 2 decades, Nick Cave has exhibited extensively across the US and Europe and worked with students, communities, professional and non-professional dancers in the development of his groundbreaking projects. Please make him welcome. Tonight, Nick will be speaking to Dr. Andrew Frost, who is an art critic, writer, broadcaster and lecturer. He is a regular contributor to the Sydney Morning Herald and is the art critic for The Guardian Australia. Andrew is much loved for establishing the highly regarded The Art Life, which for the last 10 years has documented, chronicled, criticised and celebrated contemporary visual arts in Australia. Please make him welcome.
So Nick, you trained as a dancer, you attended art school, and now you lecture in a school of fashion. How do those influences come together in the work?
Hi, by the way. I think, I think it really has always been there since I was a young man. When I was probably 12, I come from a family of 7 boys. We're all 1 year apart, so I think, hand-me-downs were a big issue for me. So I think that was the beginning of me sort of altering garments and changing things in that sort of capacity. But then also in school, there were, not only did we have the art programs, but there were talent shows and activities around that I was completely sort of immersed in. And so I think, I was just sort of conditioning myself at a very young age to, stay very involved in these areas and working with groups of people. And so it was really just part of my upbringing and it influences my work today. I mean, there's some amazing, I was thinking we should have a fashion show in here today because I saw some amazing things walking in. So, but, I think that I'm influenced by just sort of keeping myself out in the world. And that becomes the sort of, the place where I sort of am inspired for the most part.
Was there a formative moment, do you think, when you started to think of all of that as a single practice?
Well, it's interesting because I think when in grad school I was completely forbidden to sort of work in this sort of broad way. It was, Nick, you need to focus, you need to find one sort of discipline and sort of build a body of work around that, and it just wasn't happening. And it didn't happen, it just couldn't, it couldn't. But I think, I think in undergraduate school when I started to create my own parades, it's me sort of, working in the print studio and printing all my fabrics and then making all of these things to wear and then sort of pulling together my 40 friends. And we would then sort of create this procession down Main Street. So that's when these sort of activities and this sort of way of thinking about sort of other ways of working and sort of keeping the work in the public realm and giving the public an experience was sort of it was almost as if I would use the sort of public realm as my laboratory, in a sense.
You were saying earlier that you spent 10 years as a designer.
Mm-hmm.
During that time, were you thinking of yourself as someone who was involved in the world of fashion, or were you thinking of it even at that time as part of your artistic practice?
Honestly, I think I was running away from my truth, which was to be this artist. So I think it was really a cover-up at the end of the day. I mean, although I was completely committed and did amazing clothing, primarily black, brown, and gray, was my color palette. But, you know, I really enjoyed that industry. I enjoyed going to markets, showing the collection. I knew that I wasn't a conventional designer, so, you know, it took some time for me to find the markets that understood my vision, my point of view. And once that was established, it was really quite amazing to be able to work with these these buyers and to be able to do what I wanted to do, which makes it great. But then I had a store for 10 years as well, so, which I used that sort of facility as a, sort of really as a laboratory. I mean, that's where I would sort of do a lot more experimental things. And the thing that I knew is that each and everything that I made, it belonged to someone. So in some cases, there were things in the store for 2-3 years until the person came and bought them.
Do you think that space between fashion and art is by definition a space of hybridity? Is it where these things come together? Because they seem, at least to me, quite different ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two different ideas, but, you know, I've also been, you know, the type of artist that would, you know, I love being on the top of the fence. I love where that conversation is, you know, is it art, is it fashion, or is it art, is it craft, is, you know, these sort of areas that I still think that we tend to struggle with. And for me, it's I use all of these aspects in my work. So, you know, I'm interested in being a little bit of antagonist to sort of, you know, just toying around with that edge.
I was asking you earlier about your lecturing in fashions, you know, I guess in a fashion school within an art school context. Mm-hmm. You're also telling me that your students love and hate you. Why is that?
Because I'm hard. You know, I demand a lot. I expect them to sort of work and perform and produce and because, you know, this art world, the fashion world is really tough and vicious and so I just want them to be able to handle themselves out there in the world and to know how to sort of navigate and negotiate and play the game. They like me.
At the end.
At the end, they do.
So what are they doing in this in this course? What are they making?
Well, it's, you know, it's a graduate level core studio class. It's fashion, body, and garment. They really and I really don't care what they do. So they're working between video, installation, performance, fashion. But the center of the work sort of really relies on the body. So the body becomes the vehicle for them to sort of negotiate this sort of broad sort of platform. And it's really great. It's great for them to be amongst their peers that are sort of working across the board. So for me, it's you know, when I get back on Monday, I have this amazing critique coming up. So, you know, I'm always sort of interested in how they are sort of approaching their work, when they reach revelations, when they break down, and just sort of watching that process because I've been there and I know what that means. I know what it takes. I know what to do about it.
Do you find that your relationship with your graduate students reflects back to your own work?
I don't think I think what reflects back is this sort of desire, this sort of compassion, this sort of passion to sort of to stay interested and motivated and curious about what I'm doing. I mean, I feel like I feel like I'm a grad student every project that I sort of get my hands on. It's to be able to sort of I'm in a different place right now in terms of projects, and I'm more interested in dream projects more so than just an exhibition.
How do you mean dream projects?
It's these projects that I can only imagine, and that I need facilities to work with that can make them possible. So it's like, and there are places like that can make that happen. So
we'll talk about the individual aspects of your practice as we go through our conversation, but I wanted to talk a little bit to you about your influences, because one of the things that kept recurring in the reading that I did on your work was a discussion of the influences of Haitian art, but also voodoo flags was repeatedly mentioned. And for those of us here in Australia who are perhaps not so familiar with those forms, could you talk a little bit about them and how they affect your work?
Well, I think my background really sort of started sort of in the sort of fiber textile sort of area, and so textiles have always been a critical sort of part of my sort of practice, and it's not only Haitian and sort of looking at Haitian sort of flags, or looking at Mardi Gras Indians, or looking at even here, Aztec as well as Aborigines sort of imagery, and I'm sort of influenced or affected by all of these the sort of broader scope of ideas of ritual and performance in a global sense, and then sort of negotiating what of that is important. Not that I want it to be clearly evident in the work, but I want it to be there to be these sort of bridges or connections. And I think my interest in sort of that is that I think the core of my work, and particularly sort of performance work, really lies within these areas of performance and ritual.
You're an avid collector, as I understand it, of objects and materials. So does the idea for individual works arise from that material, or is it based on a personal history or some response, do you think?
I mean, I think most of it sort of it comes from an object. I think it's always something that is the instigator, that sort of just sort of sets me off. I mean, sometimes it's the most. I mean, it's I spend a lot of time. Me and Bob will fly. Let's say we'll fly to Washington State, and then we will then just rent a cargo van, and then we'll just take out our phones and we'll just start looking for the flea markets and antique stores, and we just drive back across the country, and we just stop wherever we need to looking for materials. What I need is really outside my studio, so it's like I just go get it. That's how I sort of approach it, and what that does is that it opens up amazing new ways of thinking and making. Because in the midst of all that, I always find something that then just takes the work to another level.
That sounds very organised and methodical, but I also read that you made a work based on a collection of gloves found in the street.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, but you know, that came out of, that was really a piece that it had to do with the loss of my youngest brother. And so I was sort of collecting these found gloves and casting them in resin and really was sort of thinking a lot about ideas of preservation and you know, one without the other, and looking at the imperfections and the sort of decay and deterioration within this particular object. So, you know, these became this series of specimens that allowed me to sort of work through
so
that.
What was the connection between the gloves and your brother?
The absence of, you know, the other part, you know.
So these were single gloves?
These are single gloves, yeah. So I would find them and write down where they were found and what they were.
There's a tendency in the art world to devalue or dismiss the decorative in art. What are your feelings on that?
I don't really care. I mean, that's the whole. I mean, I'm willing to sort of like risk it. I've always, you know, I'm always, you know, I know that, but I can't be limited by what anyone thinks. I have to do what I have to do, but I know what to do, and I know where to. You know, it's like when I was a kid, and you know, I would just do things, being ornery around the house, and just to be irritating. I know what that line is, but that line to me, it allows me to sort of create again the sort of dialogue that, you know, and the stigma that I think it makes absolutely no sense to me. And perhaps I am broadening that sort of space and allowing those that are interested in the craft to sort of, again, cross over into.
Have you ever thought of where that bias against the decorative comes from?
Oh, I don't know where. I don't. I'm not sure. I don't know.
I just wanted to ask you a few questions about your process of making different work. I read in an interview that your studio day is accompanied by very deliberate selection of music for you to work to in your studio space. Could you tell us about that? Is that sort of setting up a feeling and an ambience in the room for you?
Well, I think, you know, the studio is sort of divided into sort of two parts. It's one part is where my assistants work, and so you know, they mostly work with headphones on. Sometimes it's NPR, and then there's my studio, which is sort of close to theirs, but not right there. Yeah, I mean, my morning starts out with just sort of probably one CD that I have played for probably 12 years.
What is it?
And that is Shirley Horn, Here's to Life. That's what I play every morning.
And why that one CD?
Because I sort of, you know, it's my motto. It's what I work toward. It's just sort of completes my sort of day. It just puts me in the right place. But then a lot of times it's silent, you know. After the studio's assistants are gone, and you know, I've done some, you know, things that I needed to do in terms of personal things. You know, I'm in the studio in the evening, sort of alone. So it's, a lot of times it's just quiet.
So you return to your studio with this treasure trove of materials that you've collected from one place or another, and then you begin to work. Are you working from drawings? How do you begin?
Never from drawings. I don't draw anything. I just, again, it's the object. I just sort of, I think if I drew it, I wouldn't be interested in making it. So, it just sort of comes about based on, like in Gestalt, the video, the actual form of those pieces were me in the studio looking up at the ductwork in my studio. But the object, I move it around the body until I locate where it's going to be placed, and then that's when I start to imagine shape and form in that way. But I don't want to know what it's going to look like until it's completed.
So the process is fairly fluid.
Fluid.
Is there room to improvise and change?
It's always improvised. I mean, I come into the studio, my assistants are like, what are we going to do here? And I'll just throw, A with W. And it's really just, a feeling. It's really just sort of allowing, it to sort of have a sound, a rhythm based on pattern and order and construction. But that comes from exercising for, many, many years. So it's not something that I don't know how to do.
So let's talk about the sound suits. I've read a few different estimations of how many you've made. I think the highest number I read was 500. Is that accurate?
Probably, I'm sure. I don't know. I really have never counted them, but I'm taking a break now from that work, so.
Well, we'll talk about that in a second, but I was just curious about where the first one came from. What was the inspiration to make the first sound suit?
Well, the first one was, based on, this is when I was coming directly out of grad school. So in grad school, I was doing actually large sort of constructive paintings. And then out of grad school, in '92, the Rodney King incident happened. And literally my studio practice completely did a sort of 90-degree shift. And so then I was struggling for probably, 3 months just with how that made me feel as a black male. The more I was reading about it, the more sort of difficult it was for me, and the fact that I really couldn't talk to my colleagues about it, and it was real tough. And so I happened to be in the park one day, and I looked down on the ground, and there was a twig, and I started gathering all these twigs. But, I was gathering these twigs thinking about, what does it feel like to be dismissed, discarded, viewed less than? And so then I gathered all these twigs, made this sculpture, but realized that I could put it on my body once it was done. And once I put it on, and then I started to move in it, it made sound. And so then I started thinking about the role of protest, and so that's really how it started to sort of happen. And so then that just led me down this sort of path of working in this way, but I think a lot more about, myself as an artist with a civic responsibility and a social sort of responsibility. And so then my work completely changed. But then I started to do that body of work for maybe 10 years, and it was getting the attention that was generated around it was so overwhelming that I stopped doing it. And then I opened a store and did that for 10 years, maybe. And then I came back to this work, so.
They have, for me at least, a lot of different connotations. This like spacesuits, they seem to also act like camouflage. Are you thinking through those kinds of connotations in the work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, they're about hiding gender, race, class, forcing you to look at the object without judgment, because we tend to always want to sort of find place with things. We want to categorize them, and I wanted to sort of remove all of that and force you to be confronted with something that is unfamiliar, that has this sort of empowerment, integrity about it.
They seem to conjure, and especially in the video that we watched, a world of their own, a space of their own, and the interaction between the figures and between the installations of the sculpture seem to suggest a story perhaps of separation, or of almost like defiant separation from this reality.
Yeah. I mean, this video that you just saw, it's interesting. We were working on a series of videos, and so we were in this particular studio, and, that set was there. And I tend to, even with the video work, I tend to not have a very loose idea of what I want to do, but it's really, for me, it's about building the video on set. So I look at like this space as just an open canvas, and I just start then building the work as we're developing ideas. So that's really how this comes about. It still remains a sketch to me. I think a soundsuit still is a sketch to me. It's not ever, I stop working on it on a piece when it starts to breathe. So
when it starts to
breathe.
The actual sound that the suits make, is that the materials that go together to make those sounds, is that the thing that is guiding you in the form, or is the sound a kind of effect of the suit?
Well, I think the sound, for the most part is secondary. Like in this particular video, in a number of videos, I really wanted it to be about the sound that they make. And so in this case with Gestalt, it's really about the sound. And here we're working with shell buttons and the abacus and allowing these things to be forms of communication.
The form and the materials and the colours and the sizes of the suits have changed a lot over time. I've seen the images that look like rabbits, others that look like spacesuits as giant plushies. How has that evolution taken place? Because you've produced so many of them over time.
It's me sort of, I don't know. It's just, it's like, me sort of getting dressed in the morning, or me listening to George Clinton and talking to my mother on the phone. It's this kind of like, it's, just these sort of odd sort of pairings and these sort of, again, these unconditional sort of relationships that tend to sort of emerge through by coincidence, maybe? I don't really know.
It's interesting that you mentioned George Clinton, because a few writers have noticed a sense of, I guess, Baroque futurism in the work, and I was wondering whether you saw a connection between what you do and Afrofuturism.
Oh yeah, definitely, and that, hip-hop, the underground sort of, voguing scene. But then, I'm also looking at, an astronaut's uniform or ideas around power. Like this shape here really comes out of me thinking about power. So I'm looking at like the head of a missile. I'm looking at the Klan uniform. I'm looking at the shape of a condom. So and then I just sort of come to this intersection to sort of come to that sort of form.
So you mentioned before that you're moving away from making the sound suits into sculptures and installations, and your recent exhibition was built around found objects from flea markets and antique stores, as you mentioned before. Can you tell us what those objects were and how you used them?
The recent exhibition in New York, I knew that I needed to sort of move on within my work. I was just getting a bit bored, maybe, and just sort of wanted to sort of, again, continue to sort of investigate other things that were of interest to me. So, what I decided to do was really sort of, I wanted to then start to reveal a bit more about what's behind, the sound suits. I think in the sound suits, a lot of the political aspects of the work is sort of hidden. So this new body of work was really sort of me sort of coming clean and just sort of like bringing it as hard as I could. And so I was then collecting these sort of black memorabilia, sort of highly charged, very despairing, very repressive objects. I mean, like really difficult objects to sort of, for me to sort of even to absorb. And then also in taking these and sort of, and again, sort of allowing them to negotiate the sort of setting in which they were all placed in. But it was me wanting to sort of have this sort of conversation around, I mean, the fact that a race could also be sort of developed into this sort of racial consumerism was just sort of crazy and interesting to me. And so that's really what I was interested in sort of talking about and wanting to sort of, again, build and open up this sort of dialogue there.
Did you have any misgivings about working with those objects that, encoded with racial stereotypes and racist iconography?
No. I mean, I knew that I knew that I had to do it. It was just something that, was, we just know when we have to do something. So it's like, and, I wanted to move on from the sound suits and, I started to think about, what does that mean? And what do I transfer over into this new body of work from that work? And it's really, it comes down to just the essence. And I knew that if I could transfer that over, then I would be okay. So it was not, I was totally psyched and charged and was ready to sort of take on what would perhaps be a difficult sort of task, but it was fine.
Could you describe the transformation? Because you didn't simply just take these objects and represent them. You incorporated them into new sculptures and so on.
Yeah, but I did reincorporate them into new sculptures, but the object was really the heart of each individual piece. So it was not that I did a great deal of changing what its function was, but perhaps what I was doing is changing the way in which we read the object. So it became sort of me negotiating how do I want this object to be sort of considered or reconsidered, and and the shift of meaning in that form.
Did you have any anticipation of how this work might be received?
Okay. We have 2 minutes.
Please.
Say that again.
Did you have any anticipation of how these works might be received?
Yes. And no. You know, I think in the studio, I think what happens in this, I think, you know, my studio practice is so sort of, it's such a private affair. It's so isolated. So I think that I've always learned more about my work once it leaves the studio. And so, again, I have to be willing to sort of, like, take that leap of faith and just sort of, like, you know, take a deep breath and, like, hope for the best.
Before we finish, before we finish, I wanted to ask you about your public performance pieces, particularly Heard, which was, I think I counted 3 performances of that, one in Grand Central Station in New York, another in Dallas, and I believe another in Hong Kong. Can you describe what it was and what happened in the performance?
Well, you know, that was a piece that started in Texas at North Texas State University, and it was actually it was a residency that they invited me to participate in, and I said I would if I could work with the music department, the dance department, and the art department. So then the art department built the object, the dance department performed the piece, and then the music department wrote the score. Because again, I was very interested in this sort of inner sort of disciplinary of bringing these sort of departments together, because, you know, at every school it's like we all talk about sort of this interdisciplinary sort of practice, and yet we're all, you know, so isolated within our programs. And so it started there. They built the work. We did some of it in the studio, and, you know, it was amazing, particularly in New York, because in New York, I worked with the Avon Ailey School, and then with Arts for Transit, which was Grand Central Station. So it was a project that we had one evening for rehearsal, and then we had to perform it the next morning in Grand Central Station because we didn't have any rehearsal space, and it started that following morning. I mean, what do I? But I understand dancers too, so I understand that, you know, you can understand, you know, we can come up with a choreography piece and dancers will get it in 20 minutes. So we sort of, that's how we think, that's how we operate, and that's how it happens. And so we performed it for 1 week, twice a day in New York.
So these are raffia horses, essentially. Two people to a horse dancing in the concourse.
Yeah. And, you know, with Grand Central Station, you know, it's, you know, it's amazing what, you know, in the midst of these sort of public spaces, what you can and cannot do. So there was no storage. So we had to think about, okay, so the work has to be in the space at all times. And so we had to think about, you know, okay, then this becomes an installation when it's not performed. And so all of this was sort of like just happening in the day. As it was being developed, it was all happening, and I had to just keep it together and stay focused and like make it happen. So we then decided to create a sawhorse that we then would, when not in performance, they would then be sort of placed on these sawhorses that were sort of organized in a very structured order in the space, and then were left as a sculptural form. There was no dressing room, so then I had to think, okay, we have to dress in public. And so then that was part of the whole sort of performance, getting dressed and becoming this sort of object. It was like so amazing, even though I was like flipping out. It was it was so amazing. Because when I flew to New York and I thought, oh my God, for 7 days, twice a day, I'm not going to be able to handle this. It's too much. I can't imagine doing this over and over again. But it was so fantastic in terms of the fact that, you have an audience at 11. They've flushed out, a new set of people come in. And just the morale and what that performance did and how it sort of changed people's lives and how people were affected by it. I think it was the first time that I felt that I understood what my purpose was.
I believe you're doing a major installation work at Mass MoCA, but you're also here in Australia talking about maybe doing something.
Dating.
Yeah.
I'm dating right now in Australia.
So when will we know whether you're going steady or not?
I don't know.
Well, I don't want to put you too much on the spot. I think we're out of time, and I'm certainly at the end of my questions. So we're going to now conclude with another short video. I was hoping that you might be able to introduce it for us and tell us about it.
This video sort of came about when I was asked to do this 12-page editorial for Vogue. And so out of that sort of experience, I created this new video work titled Drive-By. And it was a video piece that was installed in a storefront that wrapped around a corner. And it only showed at 12 midnight. It's the only time that you could see it.
Just the once?
Just at 12 midnight to about 12:30. And so for maybe 3 weeks. And so, and that's how Drive-By came about. In order to see, you have to drive by to see it. So here it is.
Before we see Drive-By, I just wanted to say thank you so much. And ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Nick Cave.
Thanks. Awesome.
Thanks.